Iran tried this before. Not the nuclear program, not the proxy network, not the specific configuration of IRGC fast attack boats and coastal missile batteries and Shahed drone swarms that the American military has been systematically dismantling throughout 2026. The specific strategy of using the Strait of Hormuz as a choke point against global oil commerce, threatening and attacking commercial tankers to impose economic pain on adversaries, turning the world's most critical maritime passage into a weapon aimed at the financial nervous system of the global economy. Iran tried this before, in detail, for 14 months, against a naval force that had learned how to respond to it. And the last time Iran tried to close the strait, the United States Navy sank approximately half of the Iranian combat fleet in a single afternoon. And 3 months later, the Ayatollah Khomeini described accepting the resulting ceasefire as more bitter than drinking poison. He drank it anyway. The operation that produced that outcome was called Earnest. The operation that ended with Iran's navy going to the bottom was called Praying Mantis. And both of them are directly relevant to what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now in May 2026 in ways that anyone who wants to understand the current conflict needs to understand at the level of the specific events that produced the specific decisions that produced the specific outcomes. Because the IRGC's current commanders know this history. They lived parts of it. Some of them were there. And the lesson they took from 1988 was not that confronting the United States Navy in the Strait was operationally suicidal. The lesson they took was that they had not been asymmetric enough, had not seeded enough mines, had not dispersed enough fast attack boats, had not built the underground missile cities that would survive the first American strike wave and allow the second wave of resistance to continue. They spent 38 years building the answer to Praying Mantis. And now the answer is being tested against a force that has spent the same 38 years refining Praying Mantis. Start with 1980. Because without the Iran-Iraq War, the tanker war does not exist. And without the tanker war, Operation Earnest does not exist. And without Earnest, Operation Praying Mantis does not exist. And the lesson that both Tehran and Washington took into 2026 is not the lesson it became. Saddam Hussein looked at Iran in 1980 and saw a country in post-revolutionary chaos. The Shah had been removed. The military's senior officer corps was being executed. The new government was consumed by the specific kind of internal power consolidation that follows a revolution and leaves the normal functions of governance, including national defense temporarily subordinated to ideological purification. Saddam saw an opportunity and made a decision that would cost approximately 1 million human lives and accomplish none of his territorial objectives. By 1984, both sides understood they could not defeat each other on the ground. The Iran-Iraq War had settled into the specific kind of attrition that modern industrial states fall into when neither can achieve decisive military victory and both lack the political capacity to accept a negotiated settlement that acknowledges failure to achieve the war's objectives. They looked at each other across trench lines that were beginning to resemble the Western Front of 1916 and made the calculation that every economically desperate belligerent eventually makes. Attack the other side's revenue stream. In the Persian Gulf, revenue stream meant oil tankers. Iraq began bombing Iranian oil export infrastructure at Karg Island. Iran began attacking any tanker moving cargo toward Iraqi-affiliated destinations. The tanker war was born, and it would accelerate until by 1986 more than 200 neutral commercial vessels had been attacked in the Gulf, and 60% of the world's daily oil supply was transiting a waterway that had become something between a shooting gallery and a minefield. Kuwait's position in this dynamic was specific and consequential. Kuwait had been funding Iraq throughout the war, writing billion-dollar checks to sustain Saddam's war effort because Kuwait's leadership had calculated that an Iranian victory would be existentially dangerous to every Sunni monarchy in the Gulf. Kuwait was also physically shipping Iraqi crude through Kuwaiti ports on Kuwaiti vessels because Iraq, having lost the Fao Peninsula to Iranian forces, no longer had reliable access to its own Gulf coastline. Iran, conducting a perfectly logical, if brutal, strategic calculation, began attacking Kuwaiti tankers as Iraqi proxies. By late 1986, 25% of all Gulf tanker attacks were on Kuwaiti vessels. Kuwait then executed one of the most elegant diplomatic maneuvers of the Cold War period. They approached the Soviet Union about providing naval escorts for Kuwaiti tankers. The Soviets, who had been looking for a legitimate pretext to establish a naval presence in the Persian Gulf for decades, immediately said yes. Kuwait then went to Washington with the same request, knowing exactly what the American reaction to Soviet warships in the Persian Gulf would be. Washington's reaction was exactly what Kuwait anticipated. The Reagan administration looked at Soviet warships potentially anchoring in the approaches to the world's most critical oil corridor and said no, under any circumstances, would the United States permit the Soviet Navy to establish a Gulf presence. In March of 1987, Washington agreed to Kuwait's proposal. 11 Kuwaiti tankers would be reflagged as American vessels. Kuwaiti flags would be painted over, American flags would be applied, the ships would be renamed, and from that moment, any Iranian attack on those vessels was not an attack on Kuwait. It was an attack on the United States. This was Operation Earnest, the largest American naval convoy operation since the Second World War. Aircraft carriers, battleships, guided missile destroyers, frigates, cruisers, Coast Guard cutters, AWACS, surveillance aircraft, Army Special Operations helicopters, Navy SEAL teams, and the full operational weight of a Reagan-era Navy that was at the peak of its Cold War investment in surface combatants. The entire armada was going to be there. July 22nd, 1987, the first convoy forms up. The centerpiece vessel is the Bridgeton. To understand what happens next, you need to understand what the Bridgeton is. Over 1,000 feet in length, 414,000 tons. 3 football fields of ship hauling more crude oil than many nations produce in a month. Escorting her are 3 American warships, whose combined weapon systems represent the most capable surface missile defense architecture the United States Navy had yet deployed in this theater. The guided missile destroyer USS Kidd, the cruiser USS Fox, the frigate USS Crommelin. They pass through the strait without incident. 4 Iranian F-4 Phantoms come up to take a look, assess the situation, and go home. So far, so good. What American intelligence did not see was happening on the water surface the night before the Bridgeton arrived. An Iranian vessel had loaded vintage Soviet-designed M08 contact sea mines. Old technology, simple trigger mechanism, moored sphere with a contact fuse that detonates when a hole strikes it with sufficient force. American intelligence had tracked and disrupted a different Iranian attack plan, the mining operation they missed entirely. On the night of July 23rd, the Iranians laid 9 mines approximately 500 yards apart across the convoy's route and slipped back to port. Early morning of July 24th. The captain of the Bridgeton is on the bridge in 100-degree heat with calm water and nothing on his scope suggesting anything is wrong. Then everything was not fine. The Bridgeton hits a mine. The captain later described the impact as feeling like a 500-ton hammer dropped on his ship. He is on a supertanker, and it felt like that. The mine rips an 11 by 5 foot hole in the hull and floods the forward tank. What happens next is a demonstration of physics that the Bridgeton's sheer scale makes possible and that a smaller vessel in the same position would not survive to demonstrate. The Bridgeton is so enormous that the flooding of a single tank barely changes her operational velocity. She is still making 16 nautical miles per hour. Her captain calls for an emergency crash stop maneuver, all engines full reverse, and it takes 3 miles and 30 minutes to bring her to rest. Meanwhile, the escort warships stop. The USS Kidd stops, the USS Crommelin stops, the USS Fox stops well behind. And the captain of the Bridgeton gets on the bridge-to-bridge radio and says what every person who hears the recording of that communication immediately understands is the most tactically honest assessment of the situation available at that moment. He tells the American Navy warships that whatever mine just put an 11-foot hole in a supertanker would have removed any of their ships from existence. He suggests they get in behind him. They do. For the remainder of the voyage to Kuwait, 3 United States Navy warships follow in single-file line behind a crippled Kuwaiti supertanker, using the supertanker as their minesweeper. Because the Bridgeton's sheer mass has already absorbed the mine strike that would have been fatal to any of the warships behind her, the surviving logic is that the water she is passing through is safer than the water she has not yet passed through. A Soviet minesweeper passes the convoy going the other direction. The American captain warns the Russians about the mine zone. The Soviet captain radios back his thanks. The photograph of this convoy, United States Navy warships trailing in single file behind a wounded civilian tanker, was on the front page of every major newspaper in the world the following morning. Margaret Thatcher, who understood both the humiliation and the strategic stakes simultaneously, publicly urged calm in a tone that everyone who heard it understood was the calm before the storm she could see coming. America scrambled minesweepers to the Gulf. Iran switched tactics and deployed Silkworm anti-ship missiles. The Silkworm is a Chinese knockoff of an old Soviet coastal defense missile, not sophisticated by any measure available to the analysts who assessed it in 1987. Effectively, a guided explosive projectile aimed at a ship with the expectation that, if it connects, the ship has a genuinely bad day regardless of the sophistication of the guidance. In October of 1987, Iran fired a Silkworm at Kuwait. It missed its intended target and struck an anchored tanker called the Sungari. The next day, Iran fired another Silkworm, this one connected with the Sea Isle City, one of the reflagged American tankers. 18 people were hurt. The American captain of the vessel was permanently blinded. Iran declared a propaganda victory. Reagan signed the response order and called it Operation Nimble Archer. 4 American destroyers proceeded to 2 Iranian oil platforms in the Reshidat oil field, platforms that the IRGC had been using as forward operating bases to coordinate fast attack boat operations against commercial shipping. The destroyers radioed ahead. The message was direct. 20 minutes to evacuate. Then the 5-inch guns opened fire. For 90 minutes, the American destroyers put over 1,000 rounds into the platforms and reduced them to twisted steel above the waterline. Navy SEAL teams boarded a third platform, collected whatever intelligence was available, and withdrew. Iran stopped launching missiles at American-flagged tankers for approximately 6 months. They did not stop mining. Through the fall of 1987, through the winter, through the spring of 1988, Iranian mine-laying vessels continued operating in the Gulf with the specific expertise of institutions that understand the mine's strategic value lies not in the individual mine, but in the threat that the existence of mines creates against the entire transit corridor. You do not need to sink every ship. You need to make every captain calculate the risk of being the ship that hits the mine you laid last night. On the night of April 13th into April 14th, 1988, an Iranian vessel called the Iran Aegis slipped out and laid a 12-mine field across the path of a United States Navy frigate, making its way north through the Central Gulf to refuel. The frigate was the USS Samuel B. Roberts. The Sammy B, as her crew called her, was about 2 years old in 1988, a relatively new ship with a commanding officer named Captain Paul Rinn, who had made damage control the defining professional priority of his command. Every drill, every exercise, every training evolution that the ship could run on damage control, Captain Rinn ran it. The crew could fight their ship through crisis scenarios with the mechanical fluency of people who had rehearsed the procedures until the procedures were no longer procedures. They were instincts. Late afternoon on April 14th, 1988. The Sammy B is cruising north in the Central Gulf in what should have been routine transit. An officer on the deck spots 3 dark shapes floating ahead and calls the captain. Captain Rinn comes to the bridge, confirms the shapes are mines, orders all stop, calls general quarters, and makes the specific decision that his training tells him matters most in this situation. He does not sound the alarm. Sounding the general quarters alarm causes crew members to run toward their battle stations. Running feet on a ship in a minefield creates the vibration that influences mine's use as a trigger. He calls general quarters without the alarm. The crew moves to stations. He begins backing the ship away from the visible mines and calls for a minesweeper. 10 minutes later, a 4th mine that nobody had seen detonates directly underneath the Samuel B. Roberts. The explosion lifts the entire frigate out of the water. The warhead blows a hole 21 feet wide in the hull. It snaps the keel. It ruptures fuel lines in ways that send fireballs rolling through the engine room. The ship begins taking on water at a rate that every applicable naval engineering calculation says puts it on the bottom of the Persian Gulf within approximately 90 seconds. And then every hour of damage control drills that Captain Rinn had made non-negotiable pays off simultaneously. The crew of the Samuel B. Roberts does something that naval engineers later said was at the edge of what the laws of physics should permit. They fight the fires in the engine room. They shore up bulkheads with timber from the damage control stores. When the ship begins breaking in half along the fractured keel, they run steel cables across the superstructure and tighten them down with the specific mechanical ingenuity of sailors who have been trained for every failure scenario except the one they are currently living, and who improvise the solution using the materials they have on hand. For 5 hours, they fight their ship. The Sammy B limps back to Dubai Harbor with 10 crew members injured, and against every probability that the damage assessment would predict, not a single American killed. The crew had held a 14,000-ton frigate together with timber shoring and steel cables long enough to get her to port. Divers went down to the site where the Roberts had been hit. They found fragments of the mine. The serial numbers matched those of mines previously captured from a vessel called the Iran Aegis the previous year. The match went up the chain of command to the desk of Ronald Reagan, who described what he had in mind as a proportional response. What the United States Navy heard when that order arrived was something considerably less constrained. 4 days later, on April 18, 1988, the United States Navy launched Operation Praying Mantis. The plan divided the available surface forces into 3 surface action groups, each built around destroyers and support assets. The first and second groups were assigned to Iranian oil platforms that had been converted into IRGC forward operating bases for coordination of Gulf attacks. The third group was assigned to find and destroy the 2 most capable surface combatants that the Iranian Navy still possessed, their frigates, the Sahand and the Sabalan. Providing air cover from just outside the Gulf was the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise with her full air wing. The first group proceeded to the Sasson platform. They radioed the warning and gave the IRGC personnel on the rig 20 minutes to evacuate. Most of them began leaving on tugboats. One member of the Iranian contingent decided to demonstrate that the IRGC's operational doctrine included individual heroism at the expense of collective survival. He manned a 23mm anti-aircraft gun and opened fire on the American destroyers. The American response to incoming fire was 1 round from a 5-inch gun. After that single round, the remaining Iranians abandoned the platform in considerable urgency. Marines flew in by helicopter, placed demolition charges, and the platform went into the Gulf as smoke and debris. The second group proceeded to the Siri platform and found a similar situation, with a similar willingness on the part of the Iranian personnel to contest the evacuation order with light weapons fire. The American destroyer assigned to this group provided the proportional response to being fired upon, which consisted of 5-inch gunfire maintained until the structure was burning so thoroughly that the SEAL team that had been brought to handle the demolition concluded that the demolition charges were unnecessary. The platform was handling its own destruction adequately without additional assistance. Then the engagement that defined April 18, 1988, as one of the most consequential days in the history of American naval operations in the Persian Gulf. The Iranian fast attack vessel Joshin raced toward the second surface action group at high speed. The American forces broadcast the standard warnings. The Joshin's crew acknowledged the warnings and gave every indication of complying. Then they fired a Harpoon anti-ship missile directly at the American destroyers. The Harpoon lost lock after the American defensive countermeasures engaged. It failed to hit its target. The subsequent 5 American missiles fired in response did not miss their target. The Joshin, a vessel with no defensive countermeasures of its own, absorbed the full weight of the American response in approximately the amount of time it takes to describe it. 3 Iranian F-4 Phantom fighter aircraft rolled in from the north. Surface-to-air missiles came up to meet them. 1 F-4 took a hit and lost a wing. The remaining 2 aircraft reversed course with such urgency that they nearly collided with each other. The third surface action group, working in coordination with A-6 intruder strike aircraft launched from the Enterprise, located the Iranian frigate Sahand. The A-6s made a low recognition pass. The Sahand opened fire on them. Under the rules of engagement that American forces were operating under, an Iranian military vessel initiating fire on American aircraft had provided the legal authorization for everything that followed. A Harpoon missile through the hull, a laser-guided bomb through the deck, a 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb for what engineers later described as good measure. The Sahand sank. The third group subsequently located the Sabalan, attempting to transit covertly under the operational assumption that the loss of the Sahand might have caused the Americans to consider the afternoon's work complete. An A-6 intruder off the Enterprise put a 2,000-pound bomb through the Sabalan's deck. The bomb detonated in the engine room. The frigate lost all propulsion and all power simultaneously and sat dead in the water, while the American aircraft turned for the carrier. Washington called the Navy and instructed them to stand down before the Sabalan could be finished. The specific reason was not operational, it was strategic. If the United States Navy destroyed the entirety of Iran's combat-capable fleet in a single afternoon, the political and diplomatic consequences of that level of destruction might exceed what the strategic objective required. The Sabalan remained afloat, disabled, humiliated, and a symbol of what had just happened to the Iranian Navy. In 8 hours, the United States Navy had sunk or disabled approximately half of Iran's combat-capable naval forces. The immediate effect on Iranian behavior in the Gulf was what the operational design intended. Attacks on neutral shipping dropped dramatically. The specific threat calculus that the IRGC had been applying to the question of what the United States would actually do if pushed to the limit of its tolerance had been answered definitively in the specific language that operational outcomes communicate to military establishments that have been gambling on the other side, not following through. They follow through. 3 months later, on July 18, 1988, Iran accepted United Nations Security Council Resolution 598, the ceasefire that ended the 8-year war with Iraq. The war that Tehran had been fighting since 1980, the war for which the Iranian government had told its own population that surrender was ideologically impossible, that the struggle was existential, that no accommodation with the forces of aggression would be acceptable regardless of the cost. The Ayatollah Khomeini gave a speech. He said that accepting the ceasefire was more bitter than drinking poison. A man who had spent a decade telling the Iranian population that America was the great Satan and that the revolution would not bend to American power described capitulation to the realities of the situation using the specific metaphor of consuming something toxic. He drank it. Operation Earnest will officially concluded on September 26, 1988, when the USS Vandegrift escorted the final reflagged tanker to Kuwait. Over the 14 months of the operation, 25 convoys transported more than 250 merchant ships through what had been the most dangerous commercial shipping lane in the world. After the catastrophic start with the Bridgeton mine strike, not a single ship in a convoy under American escort was successfully attacked. The United States Navy had in the process contributed directly to the end of a conflict that had been killing people for most of the decade. And the Samuel B. Roberts, the frigate that every law of physics said should have gone to the bottom of the Persian Gulf in 90 seconds, her crew brought her home. Naval engineers examined the damage and concluded the repair required building an entirely new midship section. They cut out the destroyed portion of the hull, fabricated a new section, and welded the ship back together around it. 1 year to the day after the mine strike, the Samuel B. Roberts was back at sea. She served the United States Navy for another 27 years and was decommissioned in 2015. Now, bring all of this forward to May 2026 and understand what the history means for the present. The IRGC spent the 38 years between Praying Mantis and the current conflict studying the lessons of April 18, 1988, with a specific analytical focus of an institution that believed it had identified the correct response to the problem that Praying Mantis had exposed. The exposed problem was that conventional naval forces were catastrophically vulnerable to American surface competence in carrier-based aviation. The Sahand opened fire on A6 intruders and got a harpoon through the hull. The Joshin fired a harpoon at American destroyers and received 5 missiles in return. The F-4s that rolled in over the combat area got surface-to-air missiles in response. The answer the IRGC developed was asymmetry, not better frigates, not better aircraft, not any attempt to build a conventional military capacity that could contest American forces in a symmetric engagement. The answer was mines. Fast attack boats in numbers too large to engage before at least some of them reached their targets. Missiles buried in mountains or concealed in underground coastal complexes. Shade drones produced in mass quantities designed to overwhelm defensive systems through volume rather than through sophistication. Proxy forces distributed across the region that impose costs at geographic remove from the strait itself. The doctrine of sea denial through saturation. The IRGC spent 38 years and billions of dollars building the answer to Praying Mantis. The missile cities beneath Kesham Island, the fast attack boat swarms in concealed coastal harbors. The mine laying capacity that could seed the strait faster than American minesweepers could clear it. The underground drone storage facilities that survived the first round of airstrikes. All of it was the strategic response to the experience of April 18, 1988. And the United States military spent the same 38 years refining the answer to the IRGC's answer to Praying Mantis. The Aegis combat system that simultaneously tracks and intercepts hundreds of simultaneous threats. The EA-18G Growler that can map an adversary's entire radar network by listening to its emissions over 5 hours of careful electronic intelligence collection. The directed energy weapons that make the economic logic of Shahed's swarms irrational by defeating them at near zero marginal cost. The SPY-6, active electronically scanned array radar that represents capabilities several generations beyond what the Aegis of 1988 could achieve. The SM-6 missile that covers a mile every second and a half and can reach a Noor missile battery before the launch plume has cooled. The F-35, whose low observable profile makes it effectively invisible to the degraded Iranian air defense network. The B-2 Spirit, whose 30,000-pound bunker-penetrating weapons can reach targets buried under 500 meters of Iranian coastal mountain. When the USS Truxtun, the USS Rafael Peralta, and the USS Mason transited the Strait of Hormuz under Project Freedom, and Iran launched its most comprehensive coordinated attack on American naval vessels since 1988. The result was 0 American casualties and 0 damage to any American vessel. Iran lost 6 fast attack boats to Apache helicopters in the first operational hours. The IRGC's radar network went dark when the EA-18G Growler announced it had been listening to every transmission all morning. The Noor battery on Kesham Island stood down when the USS Lucas's SPY-6 radar painted it with the unmistakable electronic signature of a destroyer, whose missiles can reach the battery in under 4 minutes. The doctrine that the IRGC built in response to Praying Mantis failed against the system that the American military built in response to the IRGC's doctrine. History does not repeat itself with perfect geometric precision. The specific events of April 18, 1988 will not replay in 2026 with the same actors and the same weapons and the same exact sequence of tactical decisions. The Iranian Navy that had frigates to lose in 1988 has no frigates to lose in 2026. The American military that flew A6 intruders off the Enterprise in 1988 flies F-35s from nuclear supercarriers in 2026 with a capability differential that makes the 1988 comparison almost absurdly favorable to the American side. The mine-laying dhows that are reseeding cleared lanes in the Strait while the Pioneer works to clear them are a different threat profile from the Iran Ajr that laid the field that nearly sank the Roberts. But the strategic logic is identical. Iran is using the Strait of Hormuz as a coercive instrument against global oil commerce to impose economic pain on adversaries in the hope that the pain produces political accommodation. America is using superior naval and air power to neutralize that coercive instrument and protect the commercial shipping that the world economy depends on. The coercive instrument is being contested by the superior power until either the inferior power accepts terms or the superior power removes the inferior power's ability to sustain the contest. In 1988, the Ayatollah described the resolution of that contest as drinking poison. The IRGC's response to the current moment, the counterproposal that demanded American surrender and was called totally unacceptable, suggests that the lesson the institution took from 1988 was not the lesson that the outcome should have taught. The lesson of Praying Mantis was that the Strait of Hormuz cannot be held against the United States Navy at any acceptable cost. The lesson the IRGC took was that the next contest required more mines and deeper bunkers and faster boats and more drones. The current contest is testing both lessons simultaneously. The Pioneer is clearing mines in 4 meters of water 3 miles off Keshem, while Iranian dhows reseed the lane behind her. The Lucas is shadowing at 4 miles with SPY-6 at full power after the Growler mapped the Iranian radar network by listening to it for 5 hours. The B-2 Spirits are being restocked with GBU-57 bunker penetrators under a Pentagon contract awarded this week. Operation Sledgehammer is being named for the specific targets that Operation Epic Fury's first phase did not fully address. The Ayatollah, who drank the poison in 1988, is dead. The institution he built is still there, still asserting control of a waterway that it cannot hold against the system arrayed against it, still calculating that the political will to maintain the pressure will crack before the financial capacity to continue resistance does. The Samuel B. Roberts took a mine strike that should have killed her, and her crew fought the ship for 5 hours with timber and steel cables and brought her home. 1 year later, she was back at sea, 27 years of service. The Ayatollah drank the poison. The pattern of this strait runs in one direction. The question in May 2026 is not whether the pattern holds. The question is how long the IRGC's leadership needs to study it before reaching the conclusion that their predecessors reached in July of 1988, in the specific language of accepting a ceasefire that an institution built on resistance described as more bitter than poison. The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 1/5 of the world's oil moves through it. The Pioneer is sweeping mines at 3 miles off the Iranian coast in a wooden hull. The Lucas is at 4 miles with SM-6s in the magazines and a SPY-6 that can paint a license plate from 3 states away. The pattern of this strait runs in one direction. It has been running in that direction since April 18th, 1988. And nothing the IRGC built in the 38 years since that afternoon has changed the direction. Only the poison changes. And eventually, everyone running the calculation that the IRGC's current leadership is running arrives at the same answer that the Ayatollah arrived at in July of 1988. Drink it. Or find out what happens when the USS Lucas's SM-6 magazines are pointed at something that cannot be rebuilt in 12 years or recovered by a crew with timber and steel cable. History is running in the strait right now, and it has been running there for a long time.